All right, so today we're doing a deep dive on something that I gotta say really had me kind of fascinated, and that is drug and alcohol addiction counseling. You sent over some super interesting stuff from RoleCatcher's career library, uh, specifically their guide to this exact career.
Mm.
And what I always find so cool about these guides is they really don't sugarcoat things. You know, they give it to you straight up, warts and all.
Yeah. And that's so important because this isn't just some like trendy career move, it's about making a real difference in people's lives. So I think our
Mhm.
mission today is to kind of go beyond those glossy brochures that you see out there and really kind of unpack what this is all about.
Yeah. And I think, at a basic level, most people understand the kind of core premise, right? Like
Mhm.
helping people through recovery, offering support. But the guide hints that there's so much more to it,
Mhm.
like a much broader scope. What were some of the things that jumped out at you?
One thing that really struck me was just the sheer variety of hats that an addiction counselor wears.
Yeah.
You have the compassionate guide, but they're also advocates. They're navigating like systems and resources for their clients. They even act as crisis intervention specialists stepping in when, things get really tough. So it's a lot more dynamic than I think people realize.
Yeah, it really does. Paint this picture of someone who's incredibly adaptable, able to kind of shift gears from, these deep heart-to-hearts to maybe even, mediating family conflicts and like
Yeah.
all while, keeping a cool head.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of keeping a cool head, the guide emphasizes this one skill that I was surprised to see ranked so highly as like absolutely vital for success: social perceptiveness.
Okay, a bite.
Yeah.
What is that and?
Yeah.
Why is it so important when we're talking about addiction? It's
Yeah.
not just like being good at small talk at a party.
Not even close. Imagine this. You're an addiction counselor and you have a client who, on the surface, seems really motivated for recovery. They're saying all the right things, they're attending their sessions, but something feels off. Maybe their body language contradicts their words. Or there are these subtle shifts in their tone when they talk about specific triggers.
Oh, so you need to be like a detective, kind of picking up on all those subtle cues.
Exactly. That's social perceptiveness in action. It's about like reading between the lines, understanding the why behind people's actions, especially when. They might be struggling to even articulate those reasons themselves. So in that scenario, a socially perceptive counselor might uncover, I don't know, maybe like a hidden fear of judgment from their family or a past trauma that they haven't even begun to process yet. Things that are directly impacting their recovery.
Wow. So it's almost like having this sixth sense, like being tuned in on a different level.
Yeah.
But like, what's the practical application of that? Let's say you do pick up on those unspoken cues. Then what?
Well, that's where this skill becomes a game changer. So let's say the counselor in our scenario. They do notice those subtle signs. Now, instead of just praising the client's surface level progress, they can gently probe those inconsistencies and kind of build the trust that's needed for that client to really open up about, those deeper issues that are really holding them back.
So it's not just about being perceptive. It's about knowing what to do with those perceptions.
Exactly. And it ties directly to the emotional demands that the guide talks about. It takes a certain emotional intelligence to navigate all those complexities, knowing when to push, when to hold back, how to tailor your approach to each unique individual. And that, as you can imagine, can be incredibly draining if you're not careful.
Which brings up another aspect. The
Yeah.
guide digs into the importance of self-care for addiction counselors. It's almost like being a therapist, right? You're dealing with heavy stuff day in and day out.
Yeah, it's definitely a profession that requires a lot of giving, emotionally, mentally, and the guide really emphasizes that counselors need to have their own strategies in place, for processing those experiences, for setting boundaries, for seeking support when they need it. Otherwise, burnout becomes a very real risk.
It's not really a matter of if you'll be emotionally impacted by this work, but how you choose to handle it. And speaking of handling things, the guide goes beyond that kind of broad emotional intelligence idea and gets into some really specific day-to-day skills. What are some of the other things that our listeners should know about when it comes to having that counselor's toolkit?
Well, one that might seem obvious, but it's worth really emphasizing is active listening. And I'm not just talking about, making eye contact and nodding along. It's about really hearing what's being said, what's not being said, and even what might be influencing a client's ability to communicate effectively in the first place.
It makes me think of those moments where you can tell someone's holding back, maybe out of shame or fear. And so as a counselor, you really need to create that space where those unspoken things can kind of surface safely. How does the guide recommend doing that?
Well, it stresses the importance of creating a rapport with clients, really establishing that foundation of trust and understanding. And it's interesting because the guide actually gives examples of phrases that counselors can use to kind of gently challenge inconsistencies or encourage clients to go deeper, all while conveying empathy and respect.
Hey, can you give us an example? Like, I'm trying to picture a scenario where maybe a client is downplaying their substance use. What could a counselor say in that moment?
Well, the guide suggests something like, I hear that you're saying you only used a couple of times this week, and at the same time, I'm noticing that your energy seems a bit lower than usual. I'm wondering if there's anything else we could explore related to that.
It's fascinating how much nuance there is in those seemingly simple interactions, right?
Yeah.
It's not about catching someone out. It's about gently guiding them towards like their own self-awareness.
Exactly. And that's where another critical skill comes in, persuasive communication. Now, before you think this is about, slick sales tactics or anything, it's actually about empowering clients to find their own motivation for change.
That's a key distinction.
Yeah.
Because I imagine telling someone what to do, especially when it comes to addiction, can often backfire. So how does a counselor walk that line between guiding and dictating when it comes to a client's recovery?
Well, this is where the guide brings up a technique called motivational interviewing. It's all about asking open-ended questions that help clients kind of explore their own ambivalence, weigh the pros and cons of change, and ultimately come to their own conclusions about what they want their recovery to look like.
So it's about helping them connect with their own why for getting better.
Yeah.
I can see how that would be so much more powerful than simply imposing like a set of rules or expectations.
Absolutely. And that ties back to what we discussed earlier about social perceptiveness. A skilled addiction counselor will use those observational skills to understand what truly motivates each client, what their values are, and then tailor their communication style accordingly.
Yeah, it's like the same message delivered to two different people. Could land in completely different ways.
Precisely. And the guide dives even deeper into the communication toolkit, emphasizing the importance of clear, jargon-free language, especially when explaining complex concepts like, addiction treatment options or the science behind how addiction affects the brain.
So important. Because let's face it, even if you have the best intentions, if you can't communicate effectively with your client, it's going to be hard to make any progress. So we've got active listening, persuasive communication, clear language. What else is in the mix?
Well, this one might surprise you, but the guide places a huge emphasis on critical thinking skills.
Okay, so at first glance, that one seems a bit less obvious. Break it down for us. What does critical thinking actually look like in the context of addiction counseling?
Sure, it's about being able to assess situations objectively, analyze information from multiple sources, and make sound judgments, especially when faced with complex or ambiguous situations, which, let's face it, are incredibly common in this field. Let's say you have a client whose story keeps changing, or you have conflicting information from family members. A counselor needs to be able to cut through that noise and figure out what's really going on.
It's like being a detective in a way, constantly piecing together clues and adjusting your approach based on the evidence.
Yeah.
It sounds intellectually stimulating, which is not a word I'd always associate with counseling.
Yeah, and it can be incredibly challenging. The guide even mentions that counselors sometimes have to make tough calls, like when to involve other professionals or address potential safety concerns.
So it's about advocating for the client's best interests, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. And speaking of advocating, the guide also mentions some incredible organizations and resources that can support both aspiring and seasoned addiction counselors. And I am always up for connecting our listeners with helpful tools, so where do we even begin?
Well, the guide lists several heavy hitters, like the International Family Therapy Association and the National Board for Certified Counselors. These organizations offer everything from training and certification programs to networking opportunities, and even advocacy resources for professionals in the field.
Wow, so it's like having this roadmap for anyone who's serious about pursuing this as a career path, right?
Yes,
You've got your
right.
professional development covered, you've got ethical guidelines talking about feeling supported. And it's not just for counselors, is it? What about individuals and families who are struggling with addiction? Are there resources listed for them as well?
Absolutely. The guide highlights organizations like the World Health Organization and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, which offer a wealth of information, support groups, and even hotlines for those seeking help with addiction. It really emphasizes that people don't have to navigate this alone. There's a whole network of support out there.
That's incredibly valuable, especially in a world where information overload can be so overwhelming. And just knowing that there are these reputable evidence-based resources available at your fingertips is huge.
Couldn't agree more. And it brings us back to the importance of counselors having that deep well of knowledge to draw from. They need to be able to connect their clients with the most appropriate resources, whether it's Mosaic Array, a local support group, a specialized treatment center, or even just a helpful website or app.
Right, it really reinforces that this career is about so much more than just talking to people. It's about being a resource hub, an advocate, and a source of informed guidance. But before we move on to the practicalities of, education and career paths, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on from the guide, and that was the potential downside of limited job opportunities in certain areas. And this surprised me a bit, because it seems like, addiction, sadly, is everywhere. Why would location be such a factor?
Yeah, it's a valid concern that the guide raises. Because while the need for addiction counselors is significant, and it's projected to grow, access to services and funding for those services can vary greatly depending on where you are. So, some rural communities, for instance, might have very limited options for addiction treatment, which in turn means fewer job openings for counselors.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give to someone who's, really passionate about this field, but maybe is geographically limited in their job search?
Well, first off, don't be discouraged. The guide actually suggests exploring telehealth or online counseling services, which are becoming increasingly common, especially in areas where in-person options are limited.
Right, the power of technology. That opens up a whole new world of possibilities for connecting with clients.
Exactly. And then for those who are truly passionate about increasing access to care, especially in underserved areas, there's also the option of, advocating for policy changes or even starting their own nonprofit organization dedicated to providing addiction services. It might require more creativity and hustle, but the impact could be incredible.
It's like if you're hitting a wall in one area, maybe that's a sign to think outside the box, to become a pioneer in bringing those vital services to new places. But I think for those who are truly drawn to this work, the challenges are often outweighed by the rewards.
I'd say that's a pretty accurate assessment. Now, are you ready to shift gears to some more practical advice for those considering this career path?
Absolutely. I know we touched on education briefly, but the guide seems to go into some really helpful detail about, specific degrees and certifications. So I'm ready to unpack those.
Let's do it. This is where the rubber meets the road for anyone serious about pursuing a career in addiction counseling.
All right, so let's dive right into that education certification roadmap. For anyone listening who's thinking, okay, this addiction counseling thing, this sounds like something I could really be passionate about. What are the most common academic pathways that the guide highlights?
So the guide highlights a few key areas of study. As you might expect, psychology is front and center. Understanding human behavior, mental health, therapeutic techniques like HALA, those are foundational for this line of work.
Yeah, makes sense. You're dealing with people at such a, vulnerable point in their lives. So having that solid grasp of just basic psychology seems pretty crucial for, building that trust and creating that safe space for healing. What other degrees does the guide recommend exploring?
Well, counseling is another big one, naturally. It really delves into the theory and practice of different counseling approaches, ethical considerations for working with, diverse populations, strategies for building those strong therapeutic relationships. But here's where it gets kind of interesting. The guide also highlights the value of a social work background.
That is intriguing. It's not always an immediate connection people make, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Addiction counseling and social work. How do those two fields intersect?
Well, it's about recognizing that, addiction often doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? So social workers are trained to really look at the bigger picture, to consider those social and environmental factors that can contribute to addiction. We're talking poverty, lack of access to resources, systemic inequalities, all of those things can play a role.
So it's almost like someone with a social work background might bring this really unique perspective to addiction counseling, being able to maybe connect clients with essential resources or even advocate for broader systemic changes that could really, support their recovery.
Oh, absolutely. And then there's sociology, which again, might not seem immediately obvious, but can be incredibly valuable for understanding the social context of addiction.
Okay, I got to admit, that one's a bit of a head scratcher for me. Break it down. How does sociology connect to this work?
Okay, so think of it this way. Sociology is all about studying human societies, group dynamics, how cultural norms and social structures, like all of that, how does that influence our behaviors? And, that's incredibly relevant to addiction because it often manifests within those very contexts, right? So, for example, a counselor with a sociological background might have insights into how peer pressure or social isolation can contribute to substance use, particularly among young people.
So it's almost like understanding the pressures and the influences.
Yeah.
That could either support or hinder someone's recovery. Like you said earlier, it doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Exactly. And that holistic perspective can make all the difference. It's not just about treating the addiction itself, but also addressing those underlying social and environmental factors that might be contributing to it in the first place.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's switch gears now to maybe the more, I don't know, like practical side of things, and that is certifications. The guide mentions the Certified Alcohol and Drug Counselor, CAC, credential as a key one. What does it actually entail to earn that certification?
So the KDC is a, widely respected credential in the U.S. It really demonstrates that a counselor has met specific educational and clinical experience requirements and has passed a really rigorous exam, proving their knowledge and competency in working with individuals with substance use disorders.
So it's not just something you can like slap on your resume after taking like a weekend workshop or something. It really signifies like a serious commitment to the profession.
Exactly. It shows potential employers that you've gone the extra mile to really develop your expertise and that you're dedicated to, ethical, evidence-based practice. The guide also mentions a few other certifications, like the Certified Addiction Counselor, CESC, Licensed Chemical Dependency Counselor, LCDC, and licensing requirements for that one can vary by state, and then the National Certified Addiction Counselor, NCAC.
Wow, that seems like a lot of options for like professional development.
Right.
And it speaks to how much of this field values continuous learning and specialization, which I think is awesome.
Absolutely. And the guide emphasizes that, earning a degree and getting certified, that's really just the beginning. Addiction counseling is a field that's constantly evolving, so staying up to date on the latest research, attending conferences, being a part of professional organizations like Berkeley's, those are all crucial for ongoing growth.
Right, because new treatment modalities are being developed all the time. And the social and cultural landscape surrounding addiction is constantly shifting. So it's a profession that requires you to be adaptable, to be a lifelong learner.
You hit the nail on the head, and that, I think, is what makes this career path so appealing to a certain type of person. Those who are drawn to challenge, who thrive on making a real difference, and who are just deeply committed to helping others, navigate one of life's most complex journeys.
It really has been incredible to take this deep dive with you. I feel like we've explored like the core duties, those surprisingly nuanced skills, the fact that you can come from like all these different educational backgrounds and it still lends itself to this incredible work. And then even, all those amazing resources available, not just for the professionals themselves, but for those who are actually seeking help with addiction as well.
It's been my pleasure to kind of shed some light on this multifaceted and incredibly important profession.
And on that note, it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive into the world of addiction counseling. But remember, knowledge is power. And you've taken a huge step toward empowering yourself. With a deeper understanding of this, challenging but ultimately incredibly rewarding career path. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep making a difference.